Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 31. Don't let him down, Shin. Private Shin spent the next hour standing at attention in the corner, watching the general and the professor eat and discuss life in Idemia, who was doing what and who was coming to Edge. They ignored him, but seemed to be extending their time at the table just to keep him standing in the corner. He did his best to dismiss the chafing on his wrists and the grumbling of his stomach. He was reduced to nothing, just as important as a piece of furniture and deserving of so much attention. His life was about to change abruptly, but in many ways it'd be as it had been over a year and a half ago when he first came to Edge. He'd be a nobody soldier with the name of Shin on his uniform. Strangely, that thought filled him with unexpected warmth. But he knew he didn't deserve to feel comfort, so he continued to stand painfully at attention, trying to hold his face still, trying to figure out what his next moves might be. Maybe for now he shouldn't make any moves at all, except the ones he was ordered to make. Someone knocked on the front door, and a moment later the guard escorted a sergeant to the eating room. He was carrying the private's uniform. "It's ready, sir, cleaned and corrected," he said, displaying it for the general. Shin noticed several of the insignias had been removed from his jacket, as well as the lieutenant's gold braid. All that remained was a patch for the army of Idemia, a thin private stripe, and the name of Shin. Thorne nodded in approval. "Give it to him," he said, not looking at the private. "Call in the guards to remove his shackles, then you can escort him to Hili." "Yes, General." Shin quietly followed the sergeant out of the mansion a few minutes later, subtly rubbing his sore wrists. He wouldn't be returning to the massive house and his large private bedroom for a very long time, if ever. He kept his eyes on the ground as they passed the guards and out the main gates. In silence they walked to the fort, Shin feeling fine with the idea of not talking to anyone ever again. At least he was still alive. At least he still had a place to sleep that would allow him to stretch out fully. At least he'd have 3 meals instead of 2. Actually, it was turning out to be a decent day when looked at in the right way. "You should know, Private Shin," the sergeant said as they approached the gates. "You owe your life to one man. He's the one who argued with the general for hours yesterday that you are still important to the fort and to Edge. In fact, his future depends on how well you obey. If you go down, so does he." The private nodded soberly. "Yes, sir. Who's the man?" "Sergeant Major Hili." Shin had already guessed that. "Don't let him down, Shin. Don't be so arrogant as to destroy a good man. I'm warning you now that it's already been discussed. If anyone sees you doing anything we find suspicious, we'll eliminate you before you can destroy Hili. Every single soldier will be watching your every move. Do you understand?" Maybe it wasn't such a decent day after all. "Yes, sir, I understand completely." By the time Shin reached the sergeant major's new office, a low building on the north side of the fort, he was an expert at looking ahead without seeing anyone. That way he could avoid the looks and snickers of everyone in the compound. He had no friends anywhere. All of the men he signed up with stopped talking to him when he became an officer, mainly because Shin stopped talking to them. He was a lieutenant, after all. They were merely enlisted men. Now each of those men outranked him. Everyone outranked him. He heard a familiar voice that had been silent for days. "Be perfect. Be absolutely perfect in everything." Shin stood quietly in the small reception room, looking past the corporals who sniggered at him as they passed. His arrival had been announced to Hili, but he was busy. The sergeant who accompanied Shin wasn't about to leave until he handed over his charge. A minute later, they heard the familiar voice. "Bring him in." Shin stepped forward before the sergeant could grab his arm. He walked into the office to see Hili writing. 2 more privates stood near the desk, waiting. "Thank you, Sergeant," Hili said distractedly, without looking up. You may go. I officially relieve you of the Shin watch." "Thank you, sir," he added with a scoff. "And good luck." Shin stood at attention, knowing that the privates were eyeing him. A moment later, Hili picked up the paper and handed it to the soldiers. "You have the directions, right? He might give you some hassle, but this will explain why 3,000 men will be calling his farm home for a few days. I want exact measurements of his property. We may need to squeeze in up to 500 more. Report back as soon as you have the proper dimensions." The two privates saluted and strode out the door, one of them purposefully bumping into Shin as he left. The newest private didn't move, but stood perfectly still. Hili finally looked at him. "Shut the door, Shin." The private did so. "Are you hungry?" Hili asked, leaning back in his chair. Shin swallowed. "I'm fit for duty, sir." "But it's time for midday meal, you know." "Hungry?" Shin hesitated. "A little, sir." "Sit." "Yes, sir." Hili reached down and pulled up a plate filled with dried beef, raisins, and bread. "For some reason, I brought back 2 meals. Guess I thought I was more hungry than I was. But I'm not anymore. Not allowed to waste any food now, are we?" Shin was surprised by the wetness in his eyes. He looked at the man he cursed several times over the past few days and realized he was the only one concerned about feeding him. "Thank you, sir," he whispered as he took the plate of food. Hili produced a tall mug of water and sat it on the desk. Shin didn't know when food ever tasted so good. The sergeant major waited until he was finished eating, which took only a minute. "Has your new position been explained to you?" Shin nodded as he swallowed the last of the water. "Yes, sir. Everything, sir." "Good. I've been moved over here to better supervise the camps we'll be establishing. In a couple of weeks, Edge will be fully encompassed to become the largest fort the world has ever seen." "Rather looking forward to that," Hili said, with a small smile. "In the meantime, we have an extraordinary amount of work to do. First, this office is a mess. They brought over my files and dropped them just anywhere. Those men must have been trained by Krupp. Organizing this room is now your job. Get to work." Private Shin was immensely grateful for the task. In none of the scenarios he envisioned next for himself had he pictured organizing files. It was simple, menial work, but it was in clean air with sunlight frequently glinting through the southern-facing windows. Soldiers streamed in and out of the office, bringing Hili reports of farm dimensions and recommendations for where to tether horses and dig latrines with pickaxes. Shin did his best to work behind and around them, but they went out of their way to nudge, bump, and in one case even stab his hand with a quill. The message was clear. Everyone knew who he was and why he was there, and they were watching him. But Shin behaved as a perfect soldier should and never said a word. When it was time for dinner, Hili announced they'd be joining the other soldiers in the mess hall. Shin obediently filed in behind him, keeping his eyes down as they walked to the far end of the compound, to the hall where Shin was first recruited by Major Jordan. As they walked into the building, a hush fell over the soldiers, until Hili loudly cleared his throat. The regular chatter resumed as Hili and Shin stood in line for their food. Shin concentrated on his boots to avoid overhearing their conversations that were purposely loud enough for him to hear. His days are numbered. He can't keep this up. "Anyone willing to take bets on how long until there's another dead Shin?" "Do you smell something? I swear it suddenly smells like an old latrine in here." When he and Hili sat down at an empty table, Shin didn't look anywhere but at the food on his plate, and Hili didn't speak. Shin frequently looked at the sergeant major's plate to pace his own eating to match. When they finished, Shin, still keeping his eyes down, followed Hili out. In silence, they walked back to the office. "We still have several hours' worth of work to do," Hili finally said. "I have a map of Edge and the surrounding area we can use to start plotting camps. We should work until bedtime, then get an early start tomorrow. To be honest, even if we worked all day and night, I'm not sure we'll be ready for the arrival of the full army, or to move out by the 30th. Yes, sir, Shin said quietly. Whatever you need, sir. And thank you, sir. If Shin had looked up, he would have seen Poe Hili smiling. Just doing my duty. Besides, everyone needs someone to give them another chance. But you're welcome, Parent Shin. For the next week and a half, that was the private's life, Sergeant Major Healy's life. He even slept on a cot in the Sergeant Major's quarters. Healy's bed was pushed next to the door and window, and the private's cot was set up in a corner, away from any exits. Shin didn't mind, though. It was comforting to know that he was being saved from himself. Breakfast, midday meal, and dinner were always eaten with the Sergeant Major, the two of them away from everyone else. Their conversations were about nothing else but the task before them and the needs of the army. They went to bed at the same time and woke up at the same time. Hili had a tall, obedient shadow everywhere he went. Working on the encampment project, every waking moment kept Shin focused. He rarely bothered to notice the enormous activity taking place at the fort. But by the noise of it, nearly every older boy and man in Edge had become a soldier, and clumsy ones at that. The shouts of the drills and the clamor of training filled the fort and the tents set up in the compound. All the snow had been pushed up against the fort walls, and slowly, very slowly, was beginning to melt. But the ground was still mortar hard, and when the winds from the mountains blew at night, any new soldiers who hadn't weighted down their flimsy shelters with rocks were chasing after the tents that blew into the village. But as the world swirled around him, all the private saw were the papers and plans. The notion that all of this work was in preparation to find Salem occurred to him only occasionally. He pushed it away because there was nothing he could do to save Salem. Salem would have to save itself. Whoever was in charge of its security better be doing the job correctly. Already he had decided that when the army left on the 30th, he wouldn't be among them. He requested to stay behind and be among the few who'd help keep the fort running. Surely there'd be some filing to do for 2 weeks. He was quite content with his new existence. It was safe, quiet, and certainly unexciting. After the past year, the monotony was welcome. That's why he was completely unprepared for the office door to fly open with a bang. It was the morning of his 10th day as Healy's shadow, the 19th day of planting. He looked up from the map he and Hili were consulting to discover General Lemuel Thorne filling the doorframe. Shin held his breath in worry as he and Hili stood at attention. "Sir," Hili said, "what a surprise. Is everything all right?" Thorne, his face etched with rage, stared at Shin. "No, Sergeant Major, everything is not all right." Hili glanced at Shin, then back at the general. "Sir, Private Shin has been the model soldier for the past week and a half. He's done everything precisely as I've requested." "I don't care how he's been acting," Thorne shouted, "because it's all an act. Shin, come with me." Healy's jaw slacked in surprise. "Sir, we had an agreement." Thorne stepped up to his face. "Did you know?" "No, what?" "You recruited him, you and Jordan. Did you know?" Hili blinked in surprise. "Please, General, what's going on here? I have no idea what you're talking about." "Captain," Thorne called over his shoulder, "bring her in." Shin swallowed hard and his knees weakened. "Took me a few days to track her down," Thorne said. "Seems she was missing for a time. Claims she went on a brief holiday to relax. But she now understands her time for relaxing is over." As she walked into the office, she looked even older and more worn. While her hair was carefully curled and her face was perfectly painted, it didn't help her appearance. Amory. "Hello, Pear," she said, trying to sound casual. "Miss Amory," Shin whispered back. "What's this all about?" Hili demanded. That's what I'm about to find out. Guards, Thorn bellowed. Take him now. And it was over. Just like that. Everything. Amory must have told Thorn about Salem, about him. His long-held secret was out. The private's stomach churned as everything went gray. Hili calling, "Shin!" was the last thing he heard as he crumpled to the floor. It was the sound of something dragging that woke him up. It took him a few moments to realize the noise was coming from his boots, and it was because two large guards were dragging him across the compound. Face down, he watched as the slushy gravel passed by, and he tried to remember what happened. Thorn was enraged. He saw the general's boots now slightly ahead of him, marching quickly. And Amory was with him, her narrow boots scurrying to match his pace. There were others around him, too. Probably more guards, but he didn't know how many. He'd passed out before they came in. He hoped Hili was nearby, since he was the only man who seemed to care what happened to him. "He's coming around, General," a voice above him said. The guards stopped and pulled him up to a standing position. Thorn glanced back briefly as the guards started their walk again, going too fast for the weakened private to keep up properly. He stumbled repeatedly over his feet as the guards continued. "It's all right, Shin," said a voice behind him. "We'll get this worked out. I'll find out what's going on," Hili assured. Shin nodded but knew there was no hope. Amory glanced back at him, but he couldn't read her cold eyes. Soon they reached the command tower, and Shin was dragged into the reception area. "Take him to the files room," Thorn ordered, and the guards pulled Shin into the small back room surrounded by shelves and papers. They dropped him on the floor where he stayed in a heap, then posted themselves at the door. Shin looked up to see Amory slink in and stand over to the side, not looking at him. In the reception area, Thorn and Hili began a heated debate. A moment later, Major Twig appeared in the doorway. His face tightened when he saw Shin. "What's he done now?" "Nothing," Hili shouted. "That's what I'm trying to explain." "Nothing," Hili shouted. "That's what I'm trying to explain. He's been perfect." No one expected Thorn to smack Hili that hard, especially Hili, who fell to the ground from the blow. Major Twig took a shocked and protective step backward. Thorn leaned over Hili. "When will you learn to shut up, Poe? Now, get in there, you too, Twig. You still think he doesn't deserve an execution squad? I'll prove to you that he does." Shin was relieved he was already on the floor, because if he wasn't, he would have been. His head pounded and his stomach churned again as the men filed into the room and stared at him. Hili slowly got to his feet, slightly dazed and keeping his distance from the general. Thorn slammed the door behind them. He walked over to Shin and kicked him hard in the leg. "Where were you born?" Shin quivered in pain, tears filling his eyes. He couldn't say it. He wouldn't say it. He wouldn't reveal Salem. They'd have to kill him instead. "Where were you born?" "In Salem," Amory shouted. "Just like I was." The three men spun to look at her. "Salem," Hili whispered. "Is that the mystery village?" Twig breathed. Shin peeked open his eyes to see what was happening. Thorn nodded, glaring at Amory. "That's what Captain Lick called it, and that was Onus's last words as he died. Salem." "Great," Hili gasped. "It's real?" "So you knew?" Thorn shouted. No, only rumors." Hili rubbed his face where Thorn had slapped him and turned to the private. "Are you from Salem, Shin?" The private shut his eyes tight. He used to do that when he was little and in trouble, thinking that if he couldn't see them, they couldn't see him. Of course, that never worked. He felt a hard kick to his back, and he gasped in pain. "Where is Salem?" Thorn shouted. Shin pressed his lips together and shook his head. He received another kick in the back for his refusal, but he didn't move. "What's your name?" That was one answer he would give. "Perrin Shin," he gasped. "Your real name!" Thorn bellowed. "That is his real name," Amory shouted before Thorn could kick him again. Thorn twisted to look at her. "It is," she whispered, squirming uncomfortably. "They called him young Perrin Shin, young Per, after his grandfather." Private Shin wished the floor underneath him could somehow envelop him. To hear those names spoken here felt wrong. Thorn turned back to him. "You're one of them!" he bellowed. "Admit it! I want to hear it from your mouth, boy! I want proof!" He kicked him again, hard in the ribs. Shin writhed and clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out. "Lemuel!" Amory cried. "Stop it! Stop it! I have proof!" Thorn spun again to her. "Last night you said you told me all you knew, and now suddenly you know more?" Amory steadied herself and stood taller. "Something I learned from you, General, my love. Keep a few silver chips in my pocket, in this case, my bag." She patted the large pack slung over her shoulder and gave Thorn a saucy grin. "I will prove myself to be your equal," she whispered. "I promised you last night you won't regret trusting me, my love." She took the bag off her shoulder and opened it. Shin pushed himself up a little to see, and his stomach lurched when he saw what she had. His pack from Salem. It had never been lost. It had been stolen by her. He slumped back to the floor in despair. Neither Healy nor Twig noticed, because they were watching Amory. "This," she said, "is what he planned to wear, I believe, when he was going to infiltrate your army." She held up Jordan's old jacket as Shin began to convulse in anger and anguish. If his head wasn't pounding and his stomach nauseated, and if he didn't have some cracked ribs and a bruised chin, he would have leaped to his feet and strangled Amory right then and there. Thorn snatched the jacket away. "Whose is this?" he demanded. No name label, but he inspected the inside of the uniform. His face went gray when he saw the name inked on the inside. Gary Jordan. Gary Jordan? "How the slag did you get Gary Jordan's uniform?" Thorn roared at him. Shin wasn't going to answer. It didn't matter what he did. He was going to die. If not now, then in 10 minutes. But he wasn't going to die, having given away Salem's secrets first. He'd keep them safe to his death. Amory was doing a good enough job of blabbing everything anyway. "How?" He kicked Shin again. "Not going to do it," he thought as he winced in pain. "Not going to reveal my family." "Lemuel!" Amory shouted at him. "Please stop here!" She waved several pages in the air. "Names, places, and Sands. He was going to go to Sands." Thorn took the pages. "I know many of these names," he murmured. "Sympathizers to Jordan. Most of them are dead now, but there's only one way he could have had those names." He turned back to Shin. "Where is she, Shin? Where's Eltana Jordan? She didn't drown in a river, did she? Tell me!" Shin braced himself for another kick. He'd left one list of names at home when he made his escape to the world. He should have left all of them. "Mrs. Jordan's alive?" Healy whispered. "But she vanished?" Thorn said bitterly. "Like so many other people in the world vanished? Did you know Jordan's grandparents vanished too? Years ago. Garters. We were always told they were garters. But I'm beginning to realize something, and I can't believe it's taken me years to finally figure this out. They were taken. Right under our noses. Eltana Jordan is alive and well in Salem, isn't she? Isn't she?" "Yes!" Amory shouted when she saw Lemuel ready to kick Shin again. "I saw her when she arrived." Thorn threw the papers on the ground. "What else?" he yelled. "Who else?" His face went white as he collapsed unexpectedly in a chair. Healy, Twig, and Amory stared at him, but did not go to his aid. "Who else?" he demanded, slumping. "Colonel Perrin Shin?" Private Shin peered at Amory and held his breath. Amory shook her head. "I don't know," she lied. "He would have been old by now. They tried to keep the Shins a secret." "Her?" Thorn gasped. Amory shook her head again. "Pato?" Amory paused, then nodded. Thorne sat up. "Jatesy," he whispered earnestly. Amory looked at Private Shin, then nodded. Shin closed his eyes. What was she doing? Revealing that only key members of his family were still alive? Obviously, she had a few more silver chips in her bag. He hated dices. Twig and Healy watched General Thorne in anxious anticipation. Slowly he stood up and, staring at Private Shin, drew his sword. "I've heard enough." "No!" Healy rushed over to Thorne and grabbed his left arm. "General, no! You can't do this! Please, I'm begging you!" "Why?" Thorne barked. "Give me one good reason why this lying, traitorous swine deserves to live one moment longer." "Because he knows the way to Salem," Amory said urgently. "He can get us there in a day, Lemuel. I know most of the route, but he knows ways to find all of it. Codes, markings, he got me here and he can take us back." Thorne stared at the private. Shin held his breath, waiting for the next blow. "Where is it, Shin?" he demanded. "Where's Salem?" For some odd reason, his thoughts suddenly filled with his littlest sister, Mora. She was 8 when he left, and he pictured her in his position instead, with Thorne hovering over her ready to kick her or run her through because of her terrible crime of being a Shin. He'd never be responsible for letting that happen. The tears spilled out of his eyes as pure terror filled his entire being, but he whispered, "I'll never tell you." Then he shut his eyes and readied to utter his last words. It wouldn't be Salem. They would be, "Pugga, I'm sorry." He waited, shuddering in fear and remorse, curled up on the hard floor, wondering if his parents would ever find out what happened to him. He hoped that if they did, they wouldn't know how cowardly he died. But maybe somehow, someday, someone in that room could tell them that he never told the way to Salem. He heard the distinct clank of Thorne's blade and hoped it would be quick. In the dungeon with him. Shin had barely opened his eyes when he saw Thorne throw open the door and repeat his order to the guards. "In the dungeon with him, now!" Healy stepped over to Thorne. "General, please don't do this." Thorne motioned to the guards to retrieve the private who still cowered on the floor. "Why? Should I kill him instead? I think he'll be far more helpful in locating Salem than he will be decaying in the riverbed. In 10 or 11 days, I have a feeling he'll be more open to assisting us. I'm sure he's eager to go home after all this time. And when he sets his eyes on Salem, then I'll decide if I should kill him." The guards forced Shin up to his feet, and Lemuel walked over to a row of shelves. He pushed on one of them, and a board in the floor popped up. Another guard walked over to it, pulled it back, and lifted several more boards out of the way. Private Shin had been lying on the entrance to the dungeon. He looked over at Healy with pleading in his eyes, just as he had before he was dragged away to incarceration. This time, Healy's eyes were soft. "I'm so sorry," he mouthed. Imploringly, Shin glanced over at Twig, but he avoided the private, his jaw set and his expression sober. It wasn't as if either man could have done anything to dissuade the general now. "He won't be needing his uniform," Thorne sneered. "Take it off." "General, it's cold," Healy started, but shut his mouth when Thorne glared at him. Shin winced in pain as the guards roughly undid his buttons and yanked off his jacket. Definitely a few cracked ribs. They pulled off his boots with just as much care, and when they wrenched off his trousers, they purposely jabbed the bruise growing on his leg. Shin looked up briefly to see Amory staring at him, in only his thin undershirt and shorts. She swallowed and looked down at her boots. "Get him out of here," Thorne nodded, satisfied. One of the guards yanked on Shin and started to push him toward the rickety wooden ladder that now was visible in the gaping hole. Another guard came in with a lantern and handed it to the soldier holding onto Shin's arm. The guard pushed him toward the ladder that led down into darkness. The tears were already spilling down his face as he struggled to lower his injured and aching body into the hole, his feet searching to find the rungs. "Climb!" Thorn ordered. Shin steadied himself, grasping the rungs, and started down the ladder. Immediately he smelled cold wetness, and then a rank scent. There was no fresh air there, no light, no nothing. He stepped lower and lower, wondering just how far it was. Hili had said 15 feet, but already he was lower than that, he was sure. A guard was climbing down after him, and soon a dim light at the top of the hole started to come down as well. Again, Shin experienced the same closed-in feeling, the terror of being trapped. He was normally not afraid of enclosed spaces, but now the same hot panic flooded through his body, worse than 2 weeks ago. It took every bit of control to not scream out, begging to escape. He felt the ground underneath his stockinged feet, hard yet also mushy, but from what he did not want to know. He stepped away from the ladder, searching for the sides of the hole to see how big it was, and almost immediately his back hit the wall. The guard was nearly down the ladder, and the second guard with the lantern was following. "In irons, men!" Thorn called down. "Sir," Hili's voice was muffled above him, "that's not necessary. Once you pull up the ladder, what can he—" "Shut up, Hili! I've had enough of you today. My son, my prisoner, my way." Shin bit his trembling lip and wished he could call up to tell Hili not to cause himself any more trouble, but he feared that would only cause more. The first guard held his arm securely until the second guard reached the bottom with the lantern. It was maybe 30 feet down. Shin looked around while he had the light. It was certainly taller than the incarceration cell, but it wasn't as wide and long, with no smelly hole. The entire pit would become the hole. The flickering light revealed large vertical timbers with gaps between them, securing the dirt behind. To one of the timbers was fastened a long iron chain. The guard lashed the chain around Shin's wrist, then around his ankle, and locked the ends together. Shin would barely be able to sit down, but he wouldn't be able to recline. "Good enough," Thorn called down from his view at the floorboards. "Back up now, and don't forget that lantern." "Please," Shin whimpered. He knew it was no use, but he had to try. No one said anything back. A few moments later, the guards were at the top of the hole. They pulled on the rope, and half of the ladder slid up and out of reach. Shin looked up the hole to see Thorn leering down at him. "How much deceit can one man take from his son, Shin? You've done this to yourself. When you're ready to tell me the way to Salem, I'll be ready to let you out." Thorn stood up and said to someone, "Shut the floor and cover it with a thick rug. No one needs to hear him whimpering." A moment later, everything went completely black. Shin sat alone in the silence, trying to convince himself he had more room than he did. But the darkness pressed from all directions, suffocating him. It was impossible to get any lower than he was. 2 emotions began to rise, fighting to be on top. The first was terrified humiliation, causing him to want to start sobbing. The worthlessness he felt in the incarceration cell returned, and he wished he could have sunk into the mushy cold ground and be done with it all. He should have been killed a few minutes ago. Living isn't always preferable to dying. But the other emotion that arose suddenly overtook his entire being. It was rage, thick, hot rage. It seemed that nothing he did would ever be good enough, would ever be right. It was wrong, all of this. "I was perfect," he bellowed, rattling the chains. "I did everything right, just like you said, and this is my reward? No!" He wasn't shouting at Thorn, or at Hili, or even Amory. He was furious, but certainly not at himself. He had been perfect those last 10 days. Perfect. Deep down, he knew who he was really furious with, and listening to General Shin was the last thing he ever wanted to do. Look where it got him this time. Perfect! Hili trudged behind Twig and Thorn up the stairs to the command tower. Amory followed silently, a few steps behind. When they reached the top, Thorn began to issue commands. 2 guards are to remain in that room at all times, 2 more at the door leading into it. They will keep a detailed account of who comes and who goes and at what times. He will receive 1 prisoner's ration a day for the first 5 days, 2 rations for the next 5, then 3 for the last. He'll need some strength to lead us up to Salem in 11 days, if he's still alive. I want the guards to be listening. As soon as he breaks, I want to know about it, day or night. It usually only takes 5 days for people to begin confessing down there, and I don't want to miss a word of it. Have paper and quill available at all times. To supervise his confinement, I want— Sir, let me do it, Hili broke in. I made the commitment to watching him, so please let me continue. Thorne squinted at him. You're already too busy. This will only take a few minutes a day, sir. I'll oversee the watch and bring him his rations myself, just to make sure it's done to your specifications. Thorne frowned. Why? Because it's my duty, sir. I feel responsible. You're correct. I did sign him up. He sighed. Maybe I can get him to break more quickly. He's been learning to trust me over the past few weeks. Thorne considered that. All right, Poe, he's all yours. I want reports every morning and night. I want to know every word he says, no matter how meaningless. Men reveal themselves in seemingly innocent ways. Hili nodded. If you'll excuse me then, sir, I'll get back to work. Thorne waved him away, and Hili trotted down the stairs. Once he was gone, Thorne turned to Twig. Anything I should be worried about with Hili? He whispered. Twig shrugged. He's the one who set up the catch for him 2 weeks ago because he suspected Shin would run. He knows him better than anyone. I trust him. Fine. In the meantime, start a rumor in Edge, Thorne said. Tell them that it's been revealed to Guide Croup that the village's name is Salem, and that General Thorne is most eager for additional information. Let it be known that I'm offering a great reward to whomever comes forward with information about Salem, just in case Shin doesn't talk or doesn't survive. Amory, who'd been keeping close to the corner, cleared her throat. Isn't that why I'm here? Thorne turned to her. Of course you are, he said with surprising tenderness. Without you, I never would have known about Shin, now would I? He took her hand and kissed it. Twig did his best to control the bulging of his eyes. Amory smiled, suddenly more confident and definitely more saucy. Proud of me, my love? I told you I would deliver, didn't I? Indeed you did, my love. Took you almost 2 years, but you finally delivered to me something greater than a son. A kingdom, Amory whispered. The biggest the world has ever seen. She kissed him full on the mouth. Twig turned away. He'd already lost his appetite by watching the private go down into the wretched pit. Now he might not feel like eating ever again. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.